Good afternoon. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. My name is Bob Perito. I'm the director of the Security Sector Governance Center here at USIP. I'd like to thank you all for coming this afternoon. You're to be commended. It's a very pleasant day out there, and it's nice that you took the time to come inside and join us. We're a little bit unused to this being so high. This week USIP installed this platform. So in the old days we used to be on the floor, but now we're up here, and I'm getting used to this, the altitude. Anyway, taking a comprehensive approach to security sector reform is a relatively new concept in the United States government. And today we are going to focus on the U.S. and international experience with security sector reform in Liberia. When people who are experts in security sector reform and security sector governance gather and talk about the American experience with this topic, inevitably they turn to the country of Liberia as an example of a success. Liberia's 14-year-old civil war claimed an estimated 250,000 lives. It displaced millions of people. It disrupted an entire region. The fallout from the conflict is still felt, although Liberia, under the leadership of President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, has taken major steps forward. I'm sure that nearly everyone in this audience has a personal memory or a reflection or about their own experiences in Liberia or with the Liberian Civil War, past or present. In my own case, my first visit to Liberia was in 1997, in a relatively short break in the conflict prior to the elections that brought Charles Taylor to power. It was during that visit that I met our guest of honor today, Liberia's Minister of Defense, the Honorable Brownie Samukai. We met during a visit to the home of Ruth Perry, the chairwoman of the Council of State and Liberia's first female president. Since those difficult times, Minister Samukai has served at the highest levels of the Liberian government, including serving as director of the Liberian National Police. Since January 2006, he has served as Minister of National Defense. Currently, Minister Samukai also chairs the Peace and Stability pillar of government, which is responsible for formulating policy and directing the implementation of security sector reform in Liberia. Brownie Samukai is described by people who know him well as a steady influence, a thoughtful leader, and a person with a clear vision of a better future for his country. It is a great honor to have him here this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce Minister Samukai.
Thank you for the those very kind words. I'm glad to be here this afternoon. I see some good friends. Raymond, I'm seeing him for the second or third time here. Thank you for once again inviting me here. I see Ambassador Blaney, who was in Liberia at the time I was there during the very tough days, as well as Ambassador Klein, who was in the audience. Really appreciate it when we started the whole peace process in 2003. And of course, I met Dr. Pam at Harvard when he was lecturing one of those programs on Africa, and since then we have had a very good relationship. Thank you so much for inviting me. What I'd like to do is to see how I can share with you some of the the processes we put in place since President Sirleaf came to power in 2006 with regards to transforming Liberia from a war-torn country, a failed state, to a state that is steady and making progress and trying to make a difference in the region. And then at the same time, we talk about with you on the engagement we have had with the UN mission in Liberia, going through the transitional process, and then looking at the challenges in the transitional process and the way forward to get out of it. You're aware that just on January 16, the second term of President Sirleaf was inaugurated as the second successful election we have had since post-conflict Liberia. Madam Sirleaf, you know full well, is very clear in her mind as to where she wants to take Liberia, but she's been faced with a lot of challenges. Those challenges include not only putting systems in place or processes in place but also trying to restore confidence in the region that Liberia is not going to be a pivotal region or state of conflict, but rather one of peace and stability. In her inaugural address, she said, and I quote, "Liberia is no longer a place of conflict, war, and deprivation. We are no longer the country our citizens want to run away from, our international partners pitied, and our neighbors feared. We have earned our rightful place as a beacon of democracy, a country of hope, and a country of opportunity." The intention here is to provide hope and aspiration for the people of our country, and I think that is where we have come. The October and November election of 2011 were a very milestone to all of us, very successful as rated by the international community and as well as the people in the region. She was sworn in, and she was taking an oath that this should no longer be a place of conflict. She laid out a message of stability for not only Liberia but also the sub-region, emphasizing that the Liberian people who have suffered all of these years need to have hope and betterment for the future. Liberia has emerged as a regional leader now in stabilization efforts. When the Guinean military coup took place, President Sirleaf was very instrumental in working with our partners in going to Burkina Faso, in which I was part of that discussion, to talk to President Didi Camara to allow for the peaceful transition so that civilian rule can take place. Today, just a couple of days ago, President Sirleaf was part of the delegation going to Mali, again to try to urge the leaders to reverse that coup. As the present chairman of the Monroe Union, President Sirleaf has hosted meetings and discussions with heads of state regarding regional and international security. These discussions have led to positive dialogue towards successful intervention in Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, and many other cases along. Collective security has helped, through the ECOWAS region and others, pave the way for peace and political stability in Liberia and the sub-region. It is this peace that allows Liberians and others, like farmers, to return to the field, children to return to school, market women to start to earn a living, and invite foreign investors to return to our country. Liberia's peace has contributed to economic development through trade within the sub-region. Recently, the President launched what she called Vision 2030. It's a medium-term development agenda for Liberia encompassing a participatory approach similar to the poverty reduction strategy she launched in 2006. What she did in launching Vision 2020 was to go throughout the country. She visited all of the regional headquarters, had discussion with the local leaders, the population, women, civil society, traditional leaders, trying to chart a course to make sure that the progress Liberia have made is irreversible. Where are we today with regards to the security sector? In 2005, the U.S. government, out of the 2003 agreement in which Ambassador Klein was very instrumental in helping to put in place, lay out the basis for restructuring the security sector reform. Regarding the military, the U.S. decided to take the lead in the process. Regarding the Liberian National Police and the other security agencies, the United Nations mission decided to take the lead in helping us to restore confidence in the police and the other security agencies. For an example, the Armed Forces of Liberia, the last recruitment took place a couple of years ago in 2009, based upon an empirical vetting process. Initially, the AFL had about 13,000 former combatants. All of them had to be let go on a special order number 5. And I think we have to give credit to Ambassador Klein and Chairman Judy Bryan at the time for laying the basis for us to institute security sector reform in the military. On the police side, we went through a process of lustration, which allowed for certain elements of the police to remain and then others will be trained and brought into the process. The difference between the two is the vetting process for inclusion into the two agencies. In the military, everyone had to be vetted from the first to the last, from the private to the next senior officer. Everybody had to be vetted, and you have to go through a non-judicial vetting process so that information acquired will not be used against you, and therefore it made it possible for people to provide information without any retribution to take place. And as a result, we have a very good history of the caliber of qualified persons that are in there. Once you identify, applications are vetted prior to be recommended to the Joint Personnel Board. Even after going through the recruiting process, there was another board called the JPB, the Joint Personnel Board, that had to certify that the process that finally selected you was free and fair and credible. So over the past several years, the U.S. government has provided funding for refurbishing military facilities for the Armed Forces of Liberia in spite of the challenges that are there. They have turned over these facilities to the Liberian military. The concept for the handover were gradual turning over of these responsibilities to the MOD, symbolizing growth and achievement of the armed forces of Liberia. 2011, President Sirleaf said that by 2014, Liberia must be prepared so that a Liberian can assume the duties of Chief of Staff or head of the Liberian Armed Forces. Today we have an ECOWAS general who is really helping us to lay the basis in bringing up a credible military. But she won by 2014, a Liberian must emerge as the new Chief of Staff. She also said that by 2014, the Liberian Armed Forces must be operational to be able to conduct 2 missions at the same time in other end, as well as their constitutional duties and responsibilities. These are very tough orders by the Commander-in-Chief. That is our intention, and that is what we intend to work towards achieving. The 2 missions are to focus on protecting our territorial integrity and contributing to regional and international peace and security. The Liberian Coast Guard must be prepared to strengthen our Liberian maritime shoals. We have investors from the U.S., including Chevron and others, who are conducting oil exploration out there, and the Liberian maritime domain has to be properly protected. Through support from our bilateral partners, progress has been made in the area of training and logistics. Today, we have a good relationship with the U.S. Africa Command. If you can recall, a couple of years ago, Liberia, through President Sirleaf, was the first country that welcomed AFRICOM onto the continent and onto Liberia. And to the best of my recollection, the doors are still open for the AFRICOM relationship and engagement. Most recently, we do have a partnership with the Michigan National Guard that have had at least 20 persons, 20 National Guard officers and NCOs that are personally helping in Liberia. Along that, we also have ECOWAS officers helping us involved in the military, what we call the defense sector reform, the reform process. The critical assistance provided by the U.S. government and the United States Congress has been significant in strengthening human capacity, ensuring quality security personnel are being trained, and supporting Liberian resource capacity. Our Coast Guard is up and running, although quite small, but the intention is to see how we can expand that capacity to protect our maritime domain. The Liberian National Police, which has the major responsibility of providing law enforcement throughout the country, is still faced with several challenges. Still quite a small force of a little over 4,000 persons. Taking a ratio of 1 to 8,000, 1 police or 8,000 persons, you can see that the present strength of the Liberian National Police is half of what is required. So it is extremely important that we go through a further recruiting and vetting exercise to increase the capacity. The intention is to make sure that we have a credible law enforcement entity, which is like the Liberian National Police, to provide confidence and protection of our civilian population. The United Nations has done extremely well, but the U.S. came in and did something even better. Through the UN process, you have personalities from different countries providing training to the Liberian National Police. It's almost like imagining several different chefs trying to prepare a single meal. So we then asked the U.S., and the U.S. came in and took one element of that is through the, and created what we call the Emergency Response Unit. Highly trained, almost like a SWAT team, fully equipped, highly mobile, with all of the equipment that one would need, and train these individuals. Less than 500, they're about 300, a little over 300 persons. Although the target is 500. But it just tells you what a country with a doctrine in training, taking a group of persons, going through a rigorous recruiting and vetting process and training them can make a difference. We respect the intention of the United Nations to help us in that, but we believe with regards to law enforcement, it's always good to have a country that has a doctrine to be able to pass on. The UN has led the initial efforts, and we actually thank them for all the work they have done. However, there are areas that need to be improved, and that is what we would like to do. And I must say here, when you look at the SSR process going through the Ministry of Defense on the recruiting and vetting process, the illustration process in the Liberian National Police, the support from the U.S. government to retrain the Secret Service in protecting the president, there's still a couple of gaps. The border police, what we call the Bureau of Immigration. That entity still requires the kind of restructuring that the military has already undergone. That is needed if we have to have a credible, broader security umbrella to take care of the security problems in the country. However, we do have a couple of assistance from some of our partners, like the Dutch. The Dutch government provided some funding to help to train new and better immigration personnel. But then it's almost going to be the same thing like the police, the lustration process, where you still have elements that needed to be retired, retrenched, and sent home, and then adding them to already new and qualified person getting emerged into already existing problems. You're not quite sure whether you see the kind of difference that you're talking about. So those are the kind of reform process that are needed. The legal basis for all of this started with the President's National Security Strategy statement that she came out with several years earlier. Follow that, you then came out with the National Defense Strategy, which is also on the way. Following that came with the what you call the New Defense Act of 2008. The police reform process is ongoing. A long-term strategy document has already been produced by the Liberian National Police. Similarly, the Bureau of Immigration has also done the same thing. But how do we bring all of this together to make sure that we have a very credible reform, security sector reform process? What the government did was in 2010 was to set up what they call the National Security and Intelligence Act, which was more of a reform process, taking those many splinter agencies. We had overlapping functions. You had the Ministry of National Security performing intelligence. You had the National Security Agency performing intelligence. You had the Drug Enforcement Agency performing drug enforcement functions. You had the Liberian National Police conducting drug enforcement functions. You had the National Bureau of Investigation conducting transnational crimes. And you had the Liberian National Police doing the same thing. So this new National Intelligence Act was to amalgamate all of these to ensure that we have one entity, which is the National Security Agency will be the lead in terms of national intelligence, and the Liberian National Police will be the lead in terms of general law enforcement. But because of the intrinsic nature of drugs and narcotics globally, Liberia intends to maintain the Drug Enforcement Agency as an agency of its own to continue its collaboration with the U.S. government, other security agencies that are involved in the process. It is hopeful that all of these will lead to a much better security sector reform process. And that brings us into the transition. How prepared is Liberia for this transition process that is underway? Have we been able to sufficiently prepare our security institutions to perform those tasks? Are the resources available to support this reform process? And is there a recurrent budgetary process to sustain all of this? Those engagements started about 2 years ago with the United Nations. And we started first by conducting a nationwide security assessment between the UN and Liberia about the entire country as well as the region. That security assessment informed what later on followed into establishing a transitional threshold, which laid the basis for moving forward. The election was the main threshold that we could have a successful election free of violence, successful inauguration, that could lay the basis for moving forward with the transitional talks. Secondly, the assessment also discovered what we call capacity gaps, the ability of the government and the security institutions to be prepared to assume those responsibilities once the United Nations leave. Thirdly, we're able to identify resource gaps. What were the resources needed and required to enable the capacity gaps that were there to be filled to allow the government to achieve the transitional sources that it was looking for? The cost involved, at least about $140 million for both the UN and the Liberian mission. From the Liberian government side, is roughly about $72 million over the next 3 years. How would the transition process take place? The government proposed and engaged with the UN that it conduct a gradual, responsible transition centered around the government capability, its resource capability, which goes from July 1st to June 30 every year. That is our budget year. Meaning that every activity to be conducted should be decided within that time frame so that government can budget for that particular process. So that is where we are with regards to the initial transition discussions. Secondly, the time frame. Should we rush into declaring victory and leave, falling into the East Timorese scenario? Or should we go gradually on a more responsible way so that the sources and investment that have been made over the last several years can be sustained? There's a general consensus that it's important that it go in a more responsible way, allowing for at least a minimum of 3 years as requested by the government to a 5-year transition process. First beginning with what we call the third tier, which is the lower tier level of the threat in the country, such as static duties, static guard duties, providing an escort for money, responding to protecting the water plant, for an example, providing other kind of physical duties. Those are the third tier level that the government can begin to accept, to assume those responsibilities, and also where you had the hard elements of the UN mission, where they had the battalions controlling APCs and other warlike materials, such as those, that those for the past 9 years have not been utilized to even intervene in any conflict, either internally or externally. So we thought even if those were to be removed from the mission area, it would not have the kind of impact that one would have if we're removing police personnel. So that has been agreed upon as the second tier. And of course, the first tier, which is the highest level for us, is protecting the presidency, which we consider to be our center of gravity, not only for Liberia, but also the region, not only for the region, but also future investors who have full confidence in the leadership of Madam President. So in those discussions, I came and had discussions with all of our partners, nearly all of the members of the UN Security Council, with the exception of one member who, because of tight scheduling, and we're able to lay this out to them with the recommendation that at least Liberia will need at least a minimum of 3 years through the transition process, that the transition process should be centered around Liberia resource appropriation period, which is from July to June, and then also that training the Liberian National Police, a troop contributing country or a member country of the United Nations, should kindly take the lead to ensure that we have a proper doctrine to be imparted into the Liberian National Police. Will that satisfy regional concerns? We think it will. Reason being that if you look at the countries surrounding Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast, there are a few parliamentary challenges that are taking place out of this year and thereabouts. For an example, in Sierra Leone, there's an election that is coming up. We are concerned about the issue of electoral violence. At the same time, Liberians have kingship, and closer to the border, you may have information or accusation that Liberians are going across. There will be concern by political parties about that. We hope there will not be any spillover. However, there's a clear evidence that the neighbors of the two countries have no intention to become belligerent. Quite recently, there was an incident in the western of the country, in Foya, in which, as the result of an accident that led to the death of a Sierra Leone national, there was some angry youth who crossed the border from the other side, came on the Liberian side, ransacked a local village. There were 4 houses that were ransacked, including what we call a kitchen hut, where you put your rice and dry them using the regular fire that you use, were ransacked. Immediately, the two governments, the two commissioners, the civilian authority from both sides immediately met. There was apology exchange, an agreement was immediately reached to conduct a full investigation into what transpired, and there was no retribution in the process. Which goes to demonstrate the kind of relationship Liberia presently has with Sierra Leone. And on the security side, Liberian military personnel have gone to Sierra Leone military institutions for training. Reversely, we also have a Sierra Leone army officer presently serving active duty in the Liberian Armed Forces as part of the reform process. So that level of confidence is growing. On the northern side with Guinea, for an example, we have gone to have interactions with our Guinean counterparts. There's cross-border changes, cross-border discussions, and there have been no belligerent action between the two. So those two portions of our border, we believe there's satisfaction there. On the Ivorian side, our concern mainly is on the residual part of the conflict. You remember just quite recently, there was a conflict in the leadership regarding the contention of the election results that led to a conflict between the Gbagbo regime and the other elements. Our concern is not the conflict itself, but the weapons that were used along the border. Because there were several persons who crossed the border we didn't see. They may have hidden those guns for use in the future or for many different purposes, or even criminal purposes. Those are our concern. However, I have met my counterpart in La Côte d'Ivoire. I met the Prime Minister as well, and we have had very, very successful discussions. Following our discussions, we have had exchanges from both the security at the highest level and intelligence section at the highest level between our two countries, La Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia, that have raised the confidence level between our two countries. And I think we do not have the kind of urgency along the border, with the exception of those weapons that we still need to find. Where are they? Are they heading somewhere? Because we have gone and discovered a couple of them quite recently. And a good number of them, some were crucial weapons. Some were, devices that you really don't want to have used around. So those are the kind of concerns. But are those concerns sufficient to have an impact on the transition process? Unless there is a dramatic change in the Ivorian conflict, we do not believe it will have the kind of impact at present on the Liberian side. But as an external element, we also have an internal dimension, and that is the election. The verdict of the that's supposed to be coming out of the Hague in the next couple of weeks, on April 26th, to be specific, of Mr. Charles Taylor. A day earlier or so, the Sirleaf would have just conducted the elections, and then following that is the verdict. Is there uncertainty and concern? Yes. How does that concern impact upon the present transition process? We have to wait and see. Mr. Taylor still have supporters out there. But I think somebody reminded us the last time that in 1992, there were 5 United States nuns who were serving in Liberia, providing humanitarian services to the country. Unfortunately, the rebels being led by Mr. Taylor caught these nuns, and unfortunately, they were killed brutally. And we are told that the U.S. doesn't have a statute of limitation on murder. So I'm quite sure, regardless of what the verdict is, there probably are other avenues of prosecution for crimes against people and murder and what have you. I have tried to lay out to you how Liberia is proceeding with regards to its reform process, how, as a result of the leadership of Madam Sirleaf, the country is taking a course and laying the basis for transformation and success. I've tried to lay out to you the challenges we are facing in the security sector reform process, with the difference between what the U.S. did in training the armed forces of Liberia, voices the challenges the Liberian National Police is facing vis-a-vis the other institutions as well. I've tried to assure you about the regional dimension of the conflict, of the environment within which this reform process is taking place, and what is needed in terms of the resources to be able to fill in those capacity gaps. We believe, quite frankly, that the support from the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress have been very, very pivotal in getting us to where we are. We also believe the kind of historical partnership and leadership that we have had at the U.S. has made a big difference in the region. We also believe that President Sirleaf's role that she's playing in helping to bring peace in the region, including Guinea, La Côte d'Ivoire, and quite recently in Mali, goes to show that the leadership of trying to stabilize the region is also taking into consideration the Liberia path being led by President Sirleaf. With your support, it is very much possible that Liberia could be a very, very good example of the post-conflict success, just as it is now, after the Timorese mistake, that today, the example in Timor in the transition process is being talked about at very many levels, so that Liberia can also be a very good example. And I want to tell the American people how appreciative we are, how very thankful we are for all of your support. And let me say thank you, and thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much. As the United States looks ahead toward the transition in Afghanistan, there may be some lessons to be learned from the transition in Liberia, particularly the thoughtful and way that it's been planned and executed. I'd now like to introduce our 2 discussants. You have their biographies, so I will limit my remarks. We up here all want to get to your questions. Our first speaker is Ambassador John Blaney. Ambassador Blaney really needs no introduction to an audience here in Washington concerned with Liberia. Ambassador Blaney is a good friend of the Institute. He's been a frequent speaker at our programs, and it's nice to have him back with us this afternoon. Ambassador Blaney's role in helping to end Liberia's civil war is really the stuff of made-for-TV movies. His pioneering work in engineering Liberia's stabilization and recovery program was essential to the country's recovery. And for his service in Liberia, Ambassador Blaney has received the President's Distinguished Service Award and many other honors. Our second speaker is Dr. J. Peter Pham, who is director of the Michael Ansari Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Pham has served as the Senior Vice President of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy in New York. He has been an advisor to the U.S. Africa Command since its inception. And in 2008, Dr. Pham received the Nelson Mandela International Prize for African Security and Development. I'd like to turn the panel over to our discussions, I'll invite you to come up and speak from the podium, and we'll begin with Ambassador Blaney.
Well, thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everybody. I would be remiss if I did not offer my congratulations to the government of Liberia, including President Johnson Sirleaf, and of course to our very honored guest today, for and most of all to the people of Liberia, for all the overall progress that Liberia has made since the war ended in 2003. You know, I say that in particular because often Americans, such as myself, tend towards short-termism. You know, we want results like turning off and on a light switch, and that isn't the way of life. I think one of the great lessons of the 21st century is going to be how easy it is to tear down, but how difficult it is and long it takes to build up. Liberia is a case in point. For sure, many problems still exist in Liberia, but if you'd walked with me through the moonscape bloody battlefields of Monrovia in mid-2003, you'd be very impressed with Liberia's post-war progress to date. But you'd also see at the same time that there remains things to do, just as the minister said, after 9 years of peace. So we'll get to that. But before I do, I want to just point out that there are a number of people in this audience, I'm not going to name them all, who played very fine roles in the peace process and making peace in Liberia. One of whom has already been mentioned, my friend, close friend, General Jock Klein, magnificent head of UNMIL when it first was deployed. Now, anybody who knows me understands that I'll always push for more progress, regardless where things stand. So if you will permit me to speak plainly, as is my custom, I'll talk about security sector reform, SSR, which of course is critical for Liberia. I ought to know I'm the guy who negotiated the original agreement on SSR for the Army and how that was shaped, and I'm also the person who went after the money for revamping the police force. I think the results are, as you heard them from the minister, very good in many ways, very encouraging in many ways, certainly not perfect, as he points out, with more reform work needed in various parts of the security sector. Now, that future agenda of work should include not only the armed forces and police, but I also think further strengthening Liberia's civilian-military architecture of national security, including relationships among institutions, streamlining, as I think was suggested by the minister, with the goal of building in more systemic resilience, more whole-of-government collaboration, which I say a little bit in tongue-in-cheek because that's not something that we've achieved entirely here either. For underlying all SSR work is the need to meet the individual nature of the security threat posed to the particular nation in question. In my opinion, in the case of Liberia, that threat is mostly not an exogenous one. In other words, the biggest SSR challenge in my mind for Liberia, even after all this very commendable progress, is still how successfully will Liberia deal with two issues. The first one you could call the Mali issue, if you like, the loyalty issue, or maybe you could call it the prevention issue, of ensuring even more completely than has been the case heretofore that there will be no coup attempt in Liberia that could unravel years of our collective progress and work. And secondly, the closely related issue is that of systemic corruption, albeit that this threat is also less than it was during my time as ambassador. These are both absolutely critical issues that are critical not only for SSR, but for assuring the continuing progress in Liberia across the board. Please don't forget that SSR does not exist in a vacuum, but rather as a subset of the rule of law. And if corruption has undercut that rule of law framework badly enough, then it can eviscerate progress on SSR. Now, on the loyalty, and I should add that furthermore, as UNMIL draws down, these two issues, corruption and the loyalty issue, become more and more important. On the loyalty issue, what is interesting, I think, is that in many coups, such as in Mali, they're perpetrated not at the top really, but by lower ranks. Knowing what the problems are inside the barracks, having strong, fully trained middle and senior level NCOs seems important to me. Stronger civilian oversight, chain of command, IG systems, a lot of things that the minister named, also can help prevent a crisis. Similarly, on the policing side, more training and institutional capacity building to enable more vigorous pursuit of corruption and illegal activities of all sorts, especially within the police itself, is also critical for Liberia at this juncture. So now let's think. Beyond any of the steps that are good steps that are being taken by ones that were mentioned by the minister internationally, by UNMIL, by ECOWAS, is there anything new we can throw on the table, anything we can think about that might help address these two key issues of loyalty and corruption? You know, until recently, I really drew a blank on this issue. I couldn't think of anything because doing new things always costs money, right? Nothing's free. You know, Liberia has been in tough financial shape for years, and now donors are under pressure. But now, Liberia itself is doing somewhat better economically and financially, and will likely have oil revenues in the not too distant future. It'll still take several years, but they're on the way. That opens up some interesting creative possibilities to consider. Rather than that future oil money threatening Liberia with so-called Dutch disease, of deeper corruption, of those resources themselves causing instability, why not use some of that money as a tool to go precisely in the opposite and correct direction? For example, more money could prevent more and better military and police training across the board, just as the minister was talking about, including training of larger size Army units as well as other steps to strengthen national security. It could allow salary increases for security and judicial personnel who really earn them. Give Liberia more professionalism, more justice, more conviction of criminals, more safety, better prisons, more national security, more stability, and all will profit. In addition, my final thought for consideration comes from my experience as one of those who helped invent and back the most highly trained, most professional police unit in the history of South Africa, in the modern history of South Africa, known as the Scorpions. This is a long story, but suffice it to say here that the US and the UK, the FBI and Scotland Yard, trained an independent police unit for South Africa that was designed to take on South Africa's building crisis of major crime, including organized crime, narcotics, white-collar crime, and corruption. To say it was a success is a vast understatement. For example, South Africa's regular police force had a conviction rate on major arrests for major crime at about 5%. 5% conviction rate in the early years of the 21st century. For various and good reasons, the Scorpions had a conviction rate of 95%. Criminals of all sorts feared the Scorpions. They were terrified of this organization. So there was also a broad society-wide deterrence element as well. Organized crime, financial crimes, government corruption, terrorism, and even internal police corruption were stung repeatedly and successfully by the Scorpions. But you know, it is expensive to create such units, and therefore, until recently, not an option for Liberia to consider. Until now, with revenues rising, probable oil money in years out, but likely coming, planning and then eventually funding such a highly trained, motivated unit that is to fight corruption and crime might be a superlative investment for Liberia, and it would complement the emergency response force. Of course, on the military side, there could also be an enhanced IG apparatus, a lot of things that the minister mentioned, better civilian oversight, further training of various types that would also diminish the chances of a coup attempt. And furthermore, the Scorpions, I should note, also busted corrupt military figures in South Africa as well. So a similar unit in Liberia would serve as an additional eyes-on safeguard. Lower crime rates, less corruption, and greater stability will, of course, attract more investment and tourism, and more jobs will be created in Liberia. A virtuous circle could be formed to help ensure that Liberia is one of the greatest turnaround stories of the 21st century, which it certainly now has the chance of becoming. Again, I want to congratulate you, Mr. Minister, and I want to congratulate the new Liberia, and I want to thank you all.
I'd like to echo Ambassador Blaney's comments and congratulate the minister and Madam President, now be well off on her second term as Liberia's democratically elected president, and one who now has under about two of the most credible elections Liberia has had in its long history. And I speak this afternoon as a friend of Liberia, someone who fell in love with the country during its worst period of time, when it was very much not only a failed state, but one which dragged down its neighbors as well, and marveling at the tremendous progress that's been made and hopefully will be made in coming years. Speaking as a friend, I'd like to just signal several areas where I think greater progress can be made that will ensure that the sacrifices that have been made by the Liberian people and their international partners over the last decade and a half will certainly be honored and maintained. I'm gratified to hear the minister speak about the need for a gradual transition. I think that's very key, because we're not, my first concern is not so much the gradual transition with the military task, because the armed forces of Liberia are being stood up, vetted carefully, wonderful vetting process, and my good friend Colonel Sandusky, their defense attaché, on our second tour through Liberia and just extended for another year, and the team there in security cooperation are doing a great job, representing well the United States and what we like to see it done abroad. But the gaps that will be left, not in the military so much, but with the rest of the UNMIL mission. Just throw a date out there. I believe about 80 to 90% of the road building and engineering that has been done in Liberia and is being done in Liberia is part of the UNMIL mission. Clearly, as the troops pull out, that's going to have to be subsumed by somebody, and it's not, as the armed forces of Liberia are being constituted, certainly not your primary mission. As you mentioned, your primary mission is defense and participation in regional peacekeeping. Someone's going to have to pick that up, or this reconstruction effort is going to grind to a very quick halt. And so there are various other capacities that UNMIL has brought to Liberia that we need to think about who's going to fill those gaps. Second issue of concern for me is the increase in the need to continue down the path of rationalizing the security sector. Certainly you've done a great job, but there's still gaps in there with multiple jurisdictions. You mentioned some of them, so I won't belabor the point. But in a country the size of Liberia, the need for multiple types of police still somewhat escapes me at times. And so I think we can continue on that rationalization, both the tasks of the police and the jurisdictions. Third area that I think really needs attention in the second term of President Johnson Sirleaf is constitutional reform. In the first term, understandably, although I would beg to respectfully disagree, there was a heavy task of reconstruction, and then when the election campaign began, certainly that was the inappropriate moment to be talking about changing the rules of the game, but now it's time. I think it's nothing short of embarrassing that Liberia is still governed by a constitution written by Samuel Doe, even if written by one of the more brilliant constitutional scholars actually produced on either side of the Atlantic, Professor Amos Sawyer. But we need to move on constitutional reform, creating, and that will signal a whole range of things that could be helping the transformation of society. Fourth issue concern legal codification. Rule of law is a wonderful term. We all throw it around. We're all in favor of it. No one's against rule of law, except in the case of Liberia, we still need a codified legal code to secure business, property rights, and all those things. We can't continue operating off a kind of cut and paste code that the late Professor Convitz did in the 1950s on a U.S. State Department grant and published by Cornell University Press, not even published in Liberia. So an updating of the code of law, and that would, I think, would help with some modernization there, not only help render justice to ordinary Liberians in their disputes, but also help the business climate on a codified level. And that's something I think the international community, it's not that costly to do that type of thing that should be engaged in. Fifth issue I just throw out there that I think, and these are broad agenda items, post-conflict transition, the process of justice. Certainly, we're all looking forward. I think the scheduled date is April 26th when Charles Genki Taylor gets what I presume will be his just desserts from the Special Court for Sierra Leone. However, it's regrettable that he's only being convicted, he will be convicted, hopefully, for what he did to the people of Sierra Leone. He has not yet accounted for what he did to the people of Liberia and numerous other individuals. Now, you've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its reports, et cetera, but there's still the need for, I think, some sort of accountability to give the Liberian people an account for what has gone. We don't need to drag up every last case, but I think there are some very prominent cases that probably would help consolidate things in Liberia. Another concern, sixth concern I have is uneven pace of reform. We've done I think, wonderful job, especially your ministry in the area under your responsibility in that sector has been reformed. The vetting process actually is a model. If we could afford to do that in every post-conflict situation, I think we would stand up very, very well more broadly. Unfortunately, we didn't do such a thing in other sectors of society, including, and I'll be frank as a friend, including some parts of the government. People who would not qualify to be a private in the reformed armed forces hold relatively high positions in elected office. And I'll call a spade. Prince Johnson, I do not think, would pass the test to be a private. And I'm not referring to his physical fitness to serve. I don't think he would pass the vetting tests, yet he is a senator. Something is wrong there. And I think that unevenness between the reform that occurred in the uniform sector and what needs to occur in the other aspects of the public sector, I think, weighs down. Then there's the question raises, of all the tasks that have been laid on the military, the continuing independence and professionalism of the military, if it gets, the ambassador spoke about the temptation of, a certain Praetorianism, or I worry about being dragged in a good way to do all sorts of tasks. For Madam President's Armed Forces Day speech last year, where she signaled a number of civilian tasks she'd like the military to do. Understandable, but then that gets the military right back into politics, and I'm a little concerned about that. And finally, I think we need to have what Liberians themselves have been telling me ever since I first got involved in Liberia, and certainly predated my involvement, conversation that has existed in certain parts of Liberian society since at least the 1970s, if not before, the whole question of Liberia's identity. It's a question long deferred by war, by conflict, but I think it's a question now that would be truly a wonderful legacy for Madam President to leave, is to open that conversation so that Liberia becomes, as your national anthem probably says, the glorious home of liberty. That it's a glorious home of liberty for all Liberians, and to have that conversation frankly rather than simply on the margins, I think would be a wonderful not only gift to Liberia, but an example to the rest of the continent, where many other places with different histories still need to have that conversation on national identity. But with all those things said, these are all things that are on a broad level that could that can improve on what the marvelous work that has been done, and one has to acknowledge is being done. And when one looks at, we're now standing at in 2012 where things were, and I think back of time I had to flee ahead of the lured advances toward Monrovia, and about this time in 2002, actually, staying a couple of miles ahead of them, driving myself back to Monrovia. We've come a tremendously long way, and Liberia, its president and the minister and the governor and the people are to be congratulated. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I'd like to thank all of our panel. As our speakers have noted this morning, this is an extremely well-informed and prestigious audience. And so we've reached the point in the program where I invite you to come and ask your questions. As those of you who have been here for our events before, you know our practice is to invite people to come to the microphones that are on either side of the room at the front. We're grateful today to have Voice of American Television with us, and also we're webcasting this event live. So it's important that you speak into the microphone so we can capture your comments. And so I invite people to come up. The microphones are on either side of the room. While you're thinking about your questions and coming to the mic, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as the chair here and ask our panel a question. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to have lunch with General David Barno, who was our force commander in Afghanistan in the early days when that war seemed to be going well. And I got the chance to ask General Barno what went wrong, and his response was, well, I think our trajectory was too low. He said, if you remember, when I was in charge, we were trying to create an Afghan National Police Force of 38,000 men. Today, it's 157,000 and still growing. And so my question for the panel would be, in the beginning, did we all aim too low in Liberia? 2,000 troops, 4,000 police, given the fact that Liberia is in a tough neighborhood. Did we start too small? And we'll start with Ambassador Blaney.
Thank you for that. Yes, it's me. I'm the person who set the number originally at 2,000, and frankly, my original thought, shared with others, it was maybe that was too high. There had been a terrible civil war, and it was unclear whether the internal situation could be stabilized at all for any length of time. And I looked and talked to the interim government, and of course, as UNMIL was entering the scene, General Klein was there too. But yeah, I signed the document that set the ceiling at 2,000, and one of the reasons I did that also was because I thought Liberia would be financially pressed for a long period of time, and they could not afford, according to my very general calculations, anything like the size of the force that was being suggested. So I think I probably cut it by 3/4. And I did recognize that there were exogenous threats involved in Liberia, but I thought that with UNMIL present and with the proper training of, I'd rather see the proper training of 2,000 than the improper training of 12,000. And so I started out that way. At one point, I even thought about a constabulary force instead of an army. But there was no money for that. So, working with the interim government, that's the way that we went, because I could get support for it and because it seemed like the reasonable thing to do and the safe thing to do.
Okay, Mr. Minister.
I think when we got in and we saw the figure 2,000, we all were pointing the finger at Ambassador Blaney. Because every time they asked me, Minister, where you got the 2,000 from, I said, no, we need to talk to Ambassador Blaney. But looking back, I think it's important to recognize that, yes, there was a study that was done by the U.S. UCOM at the time, by a group of U.S. military personnel, and I think the ambassador can recall that document, that recommended, I think, probably 2 times the number. But like you said, if you look at the cost that would have entailed on the just government had just an $80 million budget, and looking at the competing need and resources that were there, and at the same time looking at the internal problems, I think it was important to start from somewhere that was manageable. It wouldn't be the final figure, but I think it was understandable why that decision was taken. Moving forward, I think looking at the challenges we personally have, particularly along the Liberian-Ivorian border, which I don't think will go away almost immediately, it is important that we have something credible that can, like the President said, contribute to the reconstruction of the country, although Professor Pan has a concern with the military coming in, but it's a segment of the military that is the engineering company, not the entire infantry element, but just those who are specialized to assist in the reconstruction of the country. I think if you remember the Eisenhower Highway done by former GIs returning from the war, similar kinds of things we're trying to do, how they can help to build roads, build bridges, using their skills to renovate facilities, do medical outreach, that kind of stuff. I think it's important that probably that number may be appreciated a little bit. Secondly, in the same 2011 speech, the President talked about protecting our maritime domain. With a President's strength of about just less than two platoon sizes of the Coast Guard, you can appreciate that there's a need to do much better than that. So that if we were to train additional persons to meet up with that mission and the tasks to be undertaken, you can understand why the numbers for the Coast Guard will have to go up. And I must state to you that the development of the Coast Guard and its activation, with the assistance of the U.S. through a very capable U.S. Coast Guard, I think she's a captain now, U.S. Coast Guard captain, has done extremely well to get the Coast Guard to be one of the best that is emerging right now in the reform process. We have 2 cutters, and after 2 years, we're going to the next 2 cutters, and that will do much better. Just recently, we were able to interdict and seize a vessel that was doing illegal fishing out in our waters, and they have many different flags. I don't want to call some of those countries' flags, but none of them are U.S. flags who are doing anything illegal. So that you can rest assured. So that will lead to a little bit of appreciation of the numbers. And then finally, our ability to contribute to regional and international peace. I mean, people came to Liberia to help us to make peace. Sierra Leone today is going to the Darfur to help to make peace. Rwanda today is out there in the Darfur trying to help peace. Liberia would like to be able to contribute the same thing to bring peace to other countries where there are conflicts. So if you take those missions that are there, you can see the rationale for a little growth, reasonable and responsible one, clear-cut mission as to what those numbers will definitely grow. But I think the rationale presented by Ambassador Blaney for the very beginning where we started from is understandable. Thank you.
Peter.
One of the advantages of being an analyst outside government is you're not held responsible for the practical results of what you counsel. And I'll admit, at the time, I was skeptical of the number 2,000. And I know Joe Klein and I have had conversations on that, but 2,000 was not enough to really defend the country if you had a serious military threat, but certainly would be more than enough to march down the street and clear out Parliament, and we know where that goes. And I worried about that, and so at the time my view was maybe we build up, allocate resources to the police force, beef up what you now have as the ERT to a swing capacity, and then spend a good deal more on the Coast Guard. But then, of course, I learned more about budgeting processes and where pots of money come from, and sometimes what works out in theory in academia doesn't work out through the cutting room floor budget processes. So I was reconciled to that. Now, in retrospect, I would revise. I still think we need more police. I think you mentioned that as well. The Coast Guard we need to build up. And looking at the broader mission of African peacekeeping, because the international community is not outside Africa and putting too many forces into Africa. I think it's an area where Liberia could potentially contribute, and especially if you look at other major contributors, Sierra Leone is a case apart. Many of the other contributors are, shall we say, bring with them a less than perfect democratic ethos with them, and they may not be they may provide bodies for peacekeeping, but I'm not sure the political lessons they bring along are necessarily helpful in post-conflict situations. So having a democratic state like Liberia do that, as well as Sierra Leone, I think would be very useful. So in that respect, I'll admit that I would probably now favor certainly a more expanded force than what you have.
Thanks very much. Okay, we'll get to our questions. What I'd like to do is take two questions at once. I'd like to ask everybody, we've got about a little less than 30 minutes left. We've got a number of people who want to ask questions. And so I'd ask you to keep your questions short. And we'll take one question on this side, one question on that side, and then we'll let the panel respond. So why don't you begin?
Thank you, Bob. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. And I think we all are concerned about the threat that corruption and ineffective rule of law poses to fledgling governments in countries emerging from conflict. And I'm entranced by John's suggestion of a scorpion force. But my concern is, how are we going to ensure the independence of that force so it doesn't become a Praetorian Guard, I think of the Central African Republic, or doesn't come under the thumb of the president as the MCTF does in Afghanistan. I have faith in the current president, but what about future presidents?
Okay, wait a minute. Okay.
I'm Eric Nelson. I was once the country economist of the World Bank for Liberia. I'm now assisting with the poverty reduction strategy. I would like to ask the minister that we all had a very strong impression as to how well this reform is going, and I think what you said today has reinforced that. But in the second round of the elections, there was an outbreak of violence which led to death at the hands of the police, perhaps, in which the UN had to intervene. And I wonder what lessons you've taken away from that and what is being done as a basis of that.
Okay, please, we'll start with the minister and then we'll let the other two chime in.
Well, I think you're right. The November 7 incident he's talking about was the day before the election. Although it's very regrettable on the loss of the life of Kamara, the guy who passed, unfortunately passed away. And we got assistance from our international partners, I think including the U.S., to conduct a forensic investigation to establish where that bullet came from. I think it's still inconclusive as to exactly where it came from, but like the president said, the fact that there were police personnel there was responsibility that had to be accepted. And I think it led to the resignation of the chief of police. And several other persons were reprimanded, others got dismissed, and what have you. There's a whole re-looking at the procedure for responding to crisis, responding to unarmed demonstration, responding to large crowd control. I think it's very important. And that is where I think the training of the police support unit, less than the ERU, for that kind of task. Because the ERU were trained more of a SWAT nature, responding to arm-related incident, hostage situations, things bearing weapons, as compared to the police support unit unarmed but using non-lethal weapons to respond to those kind of major demonstrations. I think that's one of the lessons we learned. And I can tell you for a fact that we were in the National Security Council meeting just about the time of the incident occurring. And the decision taken in the council were very clear. By the time we got out, the incident already happened. By the time we got out to get the instructions out, the incident had already occurred with the loss of that one individual who passed away. There were very good lessons learned in the process. There's a general review of the procedure to respond, a general review of the call on where to use, or the procedure for using lethal weapons if necessary. But in that kind of case, I think it was very unfortunate that that someone did pass away. So it was a lesson learned, and it's a great experience for all of us. Thank you.
Do you want to try the first question?
Sure. Yes. In the case of South Africa, there was never any issue about the disconnect of the Scorpions and acting as an extrajudicial pawn of the presidency. In fact, something of the opposite really happened, and there was no Praetorian Guard problem in South Africa. It was disconnected from the SAPS, the South African Police, but it was still within the government of South Africa, and it had a very close relationship with the Directorate of Prosecutions. In fact, one of the things that made the Scorpions work so well was the prosecution work within the police unit itself and the forensic people within the police unit itself, rather than have them being these separate entities whereby a crime would take place, the police would go out, and then they didn't know quite how to make the evidence work so that the prosecution could use it effectively in a court. The other reason there was never any problem was they were superbly trained. They were trained at Quantico and in Scotland Yard, and they came back with tremendous motivation and sense of identity, including T-shirts. And they went on for years. Eventually, the unit was disbanded, but I think if properly trained and properly connected within the Liberian government and not made a unit of the presidency, which is, I think, where you could get into that sort of problem. I think that sort of highly trained, highly motivated unit to fight corruption and all sorts of other serious crimes could be tremendously valuable. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll take 2 more questions. We'll start there and go over here.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please. Name and identity.
Sure. My name is Mark Frankel. I was a former advisor to the Liberian Land Commission and now working consulting here in D.C. My question is for Ambassador Blaney. You mentioned using oil revenues and petrodollars to strengthen rule of law and security in Liberia in the years coming forward. My question was, what mechanism do you envision for the management of those petrodollars to ensure that they're responsibly spent? I recall a similar program in Chad where the World Bank was managing their petrodollars and it ended up being largely a fiasco. Do you envision this as a Liberian-run program or an internationally run program with Liberian beneficiaries?
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin, Washington, semester in International Affairs. Interestingly enough, my question is almost identical to the one we just heard. The other example of a somewhat successful venture along that lines was the Norwegian example, where I believe those funds were somewhat segregated and did not lead to inflation within the country. Although with regard to Ambassador Blaney's mention of avoiding the so-called Dutch disease, I think perhaps a more up-to-date reference would be avoiding the Nigerian disease.
Okay, we're going to give Ambassador Blaney a rest and let Dr. Pham respond, and then we'll go to John.
Okay. Yeah. The broad point I would make as to both questions, I think it goes to the point I was making. In order to have the mechanism set up, one has to really deal with the nature of the Liberian government. I think we all trust, as Mr. Embry said earlier, we all trust Madam President. It's not her that concerns us, but I don't like governments based on to design institutions based on people. I prefer to design institutions based on institutions. And I think this is where one of those areas where, in order to properly administer the revenues and set up the checks and balances against the potential scorpions, et cetera, we need to really seriously tackle the issue of constitutional reform and the devolution of authority in Liberia.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on this conversation about the scorpions. At the Department of Justice, when this thing came along, I was running the police training program over there, and we objected to the name. We thought, that's not really a very good name for a democratic police force, the Scorpions. And so we inquired with the South African authorities about who came up with this name, and the answer came back, President Thabo Mbeki. So that was the end of that conversation. Okay, John.
Can I just say a word here?
Yes, please.
Which is, is Matt Chesson here? No, okay. For those historians among you, you may know that there was a mechanism called the Government Economic Management Assistance Program, or GMAP, which we had a hand in inventing, and it was an external, such an external body as was described. Now, I leave it up to Madam President and others to decide how to do that, but I will say that I share the concern that was just voiced about the propensity to steal petrodollars And whatever is decided needs to be very firm and very transparent. I'm not saying that there ought to be foreign management of it, because I certainly was accused of being kind of a pro-council in that regard at one point. But I do think that whatever mechanism it handles these petrodollars needs to be absolutely, firmly, transparent, and rigidly controlled.
Thanks very much. Let's have a question over here and one over there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff. I'm with Peacework, and I wanted to thank you all for being here. But also, my question is, we talked about SSR and kind of the successes that have happened so far, and also where improvements can still take place. But I was wondering about those successes, besides just naming what they were, what do you think were the key contributing factors to those successes? What of those factors were contextual, and what of them can become like best practices? You know, what comes from within Liberia also, and what came from external players, what they brought to the table in this process? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Ask people to identify themselves by name and affiliation.
Sure. Tia Willie, Howard University. Thank you all for such a wonderful presentation. And my question regards SSR and the involvement of the MRU, the Mono River Union. Obviously, with Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast joining later, you have a concentric group that could possibly work towards more stability within the sub-region. So has there been any thought or consideration in terms of forming somewhat of a military or security apparatus from each of those countries involved in securing the borders of each of the respective countries?
I'm sorry, we'll start with the Minister.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think the factors he talked about, I think there's a clear political leadership in this. In conducting SSR, there's a lot of interest that probably led to the kind of reputation that probably brought into question the performance of the police and the military and other security institutions. Once those things become state-sponsored and have those negative impact, you would have to have the clear political direction from the leadership of the country to want to have SSR to happen. For an example, in the military, when DINCO was conducting the SSR process, the vetting process, I made a public statement to DINCO and to the U.S. Embassy that we will not, as a government, interfere in the vetting process, and the President endorsed that. There will be no one in government that will influence the vetting process to favor any one person against the other. That will allow the vetting process to proceed, and only those on the order of merit who meet those standards. So there has to be a clear political direction and then provided. Secondly, I think there also has to be a good intention on the part of the partner involved to also want to make sure that those standards set are clearly documented and people are trained to carry on that. What the U.S. did at the time was to help us conduct a training program, a capstone training program for 17 weeks for everyone in the Ministry of Defense. And I think part of the legacy of Ambassador Blaney that they left behind, that everyone entering the Ministry of Defense has to go through that training. And as the Minister of Defense, I took the decision that all of the ministers, all the deputies, myself, all the deputies, all the assistant ministers must attend and must complete the 17 weeks capstone training. So that also made a difference very clearly as to exactly where we're going with the security sector reform process. And the third thing is one has to plan in advance as to what are those benefits that will accrue later on, instead of a one-off benefit to be provided in the recruiting process. So that the salary probably started at this level, and we anticipated that 5 years later, the salary would double by 100%. And that's exactly what happened. And lastly, I think international mentorship, international involvement. In this case, we had a clear partnership with the U.S. government and ECOWAS involved, both international and regional, involved in helping us in the SSR, to allow for credibility to remain at the leadership of the AFL, to allow the process to proceed, so there is no confusion as to who is the Liberian to be made chief of staff arising out of a conflict. Do you put someone from this tribe and then later on put that person from this tribe, or do you take someone from this tribe and later on put somebody from that tribe? So what we tried to do was to have someone who would say neutral to sit at the helm of the process, working along with the government and getting the kind of advice that one can get. In the case of budgeting, for an example, we had a U.S. Air Force colonel with that background who sat and worked with the Minister of Defense in planning a 5-year budgetary projection. And that made it very easy. But those challenges are faced by other agencies. So it's very important on what you have mentioned. With regards to the SSR and MRU and in terms of border control, yes, I think the protocol, if I'm not mistaken, I think is the 15th protocol, if I guess, of the Monetary Union, which suggests a kind of security umbrella between and among the Monetary Union countries. So not necessarily that one has to rate which agency will be sent to the border, but just the intention of the parties in the region to want to decide to make sure that they can have a better kind of coordination and cooperation. There will be lessons learned, network exchange. By the 7th of April, this month, there will be a joint border meeting on the Ivorian side in Giglo between the security and military officials of La Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Similarly, a couple of weeks later, there will be one held in Liberia, another one will be held in Sierra Leone, another one will be held in Guinea. The whole intention is to make sure that there's a cross linkages of networking, building confidence, improving relationship, and trying to understand the SOPs of the different agencies that are operating along the border. On the Liberian side, we have customs, immigration, and for now the military is not there. On the other side, they have gendarmes, they have customs, they have immigration, they have different kinds of people, so we needed that kind of level of understanding. So I think that is the kind of partnership, but I don't see how one will have to tag that you must go through an SSR process before being put at the border. But it's a very good idea to make sure that the Monetary Union work together.
I wonder if our panel would allow me just to take the final 3 questions. People have been standing for a while, and then we'll allow one giant response, and then we'll be just about out of time. You want to go first? Thank you, John. Go ahead.
I'm William Hare, Associate Dean of Extension at the University of the District of Columbia. And Mr. Minister, thank you so much, my Fulbright classmate. We've had a lot of discussions, and I think it's about the future, and I'm so glad that you're doing what you're doing. But it's about the future, and it's about the youth of tomorrow. How do we build a sustainable military with a positive perception in Liberia? You know, Liberians have a very negative perception of the military. Here in the U.S., you have an integration of the Army Corps that is doing civilian work, building bridges, building dams, that people look at and say, this is positive. How do you build that in Liberia? Because that's the sustainable factor. It's not about today, it's about the youth that will be the future of the country. So is there a potential for a reserve system that is integrated with workforce development, that's integrated with the educational system for reconstruction? What's your take on that? Using local sustainable resources to build roads and to build homes.
Thank you. Ms. Casey? Okay. It's like being on an airplane. It's the same kind of thing. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Carrie Sue Casey. I work in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy. I used to be the desk officer for Liberia, and now I work on a program that works with multiple countries on enhancing their institutional capacity. So I've been working with the minister for some time. My question was about the Ministry of Justice. In kind of assessing the overall security sector, that seems to be a key place that would intersect with both the police and the Ministry of Defense. And one of the key points that made me think about that was the instance you cited about the Coast Guard being able to interdict people, but then what do they do with them afterwards? What happens? So that's my question.
Thanks very much. Jock, you've been very patient.
No, I'll let you go ahead.
Okay. All right. Let's have all the members of the panel respond.
Bill, I think, Bill here, thank you for that question. I think you probably know some secrets that you probably want to share with the audience regarding Liberian youth. Yes, I think what he's saying is quite correct. It is a concern in Liberia with regards to the young population. So what we tried to do was that in 2008, we undertook a deliberate policy in the AFL to rebrand the AFL as a force for good. In order to establish itself as a force for good, we began to began to train them in conducting civil military activities, operations other than war, learning how to go and launch a breach, learning how to go and refurbish schools, learning how to go out and conduct operations not necessarily involving the use of weapons. So we want to take similar exercises in the north of the country, in the northeast, and the south and the southeast. We did the same thing in the west. We did the same thing in central Monrovia. For an example, when the demonstration took place on December 23rd, and thousands of youths were in the street, literally the city got dirty within a single day. I mean, there were breaks and dirt all over the place, rocks. The next morning, by 0600 hour, the military were out there cleaning the streets for the local population. We're trying to rebrand the EFL as a force for good. So they were out there clearing the streets and making sure people had the way to continue to go to work and making sure that the communities were very clean. On a monthly basis, on the first Saturday of every month, which is the general cleaning day, the military comes out and go to different communities, clean up, and conduct outreach operations. The intent is to improve and rebrand the image of the armed forces of Liberia because they had a very terrible image at the time. Is it concentrated only on orders of the Minister of Defense? No. It is part of the regular program that the armed forces is involved in. So you're absolutely right. We need to continue that rebranding, keep making the armed forces as a player that can play a positive role in the community and not necessarily the bad image that that they have. With regards to the Coast Guard's interdiction, we have what we call the Joint Interministerial Committee at the Joint Maritime Center on the Coast Guard base. It involves the Liberian Coast Guard, the Bureau of Maritime Affairs, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Finance because of customs. Under justice is police and immigration. So there's a joint kind of activity which is led by the Coast Guard, which runs the platform that takes them out. Whenever there's an interdiction, there's a process and a procedure that they all have to follow. It's a checklist. Upon intercepting, what do? You have to go to that checklist. And that checklist, once again, with the support of our international partners, particularly the U.S. Coast Guard advisor that we have, Captain Ketchum, very excellent, very professional lady. We have helped to put this in place, and it has worked. In all of the cases, the Coast Guard have been involved, and the police, they have paid some very good fines. And we're hoping that we can continue to get the kind of support that we're looking for. So we're trying, there's still room for improvement. That's it.
Okay. John?
I just want to add some historical perspective here, which is, you know, every day during the war and afterwards, I'd watch these foreign trawlers go right in front of my window on the Atlantic Ocean and steal endlessly with drift net fishing, destructive, and there was nothing I could do about it. I used to get so mad about that, and so I went down and we found what was left of the Liberian Coast Guard. It was 2 ships, 2 hulls really, totally inoperable, very nice and loyal crews, but there was nothing going, folks. I mean, it was just dead. Listen to what you just heard. 9 years later, you have a Coast Guard. There's a Coast Guard. They're arresting people. They're stopping that type of illegal and destructive fishing. Yes, of course, there are problems. There are needs. But this is an excellent example of success. Peter?
I would just echo that, especially if you look at things the minister has spoken about. This was a place where a little more than a decade ago you saw a uniform. If you were smart, you fled in the opposite direction because invariably the person in that uniform was at the very minimum going to shake you down, at the very minimum. And if you weren't as lucky, there were other consequences. Now you have, as the minister described, groups who engage in civil military action are out there. They're increasingly, the bad reputation is slow. It's taking time, but it's happening. One sees it. And the only thing I would add to what's been said is just my concern is that this sector has really done well. And I'm just worried about all the other sectors. And I worry about the day when Madam President, hopefully long in the future, when Madam President is not with us, and if, something isn't done to polish the image of the political class in some areas and other parts of the society, if these guys ever not do what Ambassador Blaney has said and decide to march down, lots of people might wave palm fronds as they're doing it. Once again, that's my just concern, is that reform has not been as across the board as we'd like it.
Okay. We have a few minutes left. Jock, do you have a question?
Thank you. First of all, my compliments on the program. I think it was excellent. A good, very good overview. Liberia, as we all know, has been through what we could at best call a martyrdom in the past 20-some years, with the 230,000 some dead. And since this is more or less Easter week, it reminds me of that biblical quote, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And the people of Liberia could have said that, I think, many times. I want to compliment the minister for a reason. There are all too many people with a rucksack, a cell phone, and a video camera who become instant experts and instant critics whenever they go somewhere, without ever having been in the arena. It's easy to criticize the strong man when he stumbles, but it's a lot harder to be in the arena and have the kind of conflicting priorities and still do the kind of work that has been done. And all in all, it's remarkable. With Peter, I would hope that he would take his book, Liberia, the Failed State, and perhaps write a new one called Liberia Phoenix Rising, or something of that sort, which might be an appropriate title. And actually, I've had several publishers call me about Ambassador Blaney's book, which we're all excited to read when it comes out. I'll close by telling you, since Prince Johnson was mentioned, my Prince Johnson story. As you know, he's the man who schnitzeled dough, if we can use that expression. If you know what the German word schnitzel means, it means to cut up. He showed up at my office in 2005, and my chief of staff came in and said, Prince Johnson's here to see you. I said, that Prince Johnson? He said, oh, yeah. So they brought him in, and I said, what in God's name are you doing here? He said, well, Mr. Klein, you don't know this, but I'm based in Nigeria. I have a very large church, a very large following, and God has spoken to me. God has spoken to me and told me to return to Liberia and make amends and seek reconciliation with the Doe family. I said, well, if they know you're here, they're going to catch you, they're going to kill you. One of them is a minister of state, and there are a lot of others running around, so I've got to get you out of here. Now, as far as your comment goes about, you spoke to God and God has spoken to you, my Alsatian grandmother used to tell me, when you speak to God, it is called prayer. When God speaks to you, we call that schizophrenia. So we have a problem here, and we've got to get you out of here, and very, very quickly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So again, my compliments to all of you. None of you have any idea what has been accomplished here by some of these people, unless you had the privilege of being there and seeing it during that period. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you once again for being with us. I'd like to ask for a round of applause for our panel. I'd like to thank a couple of people who are particularly important for today's events. My colleague Ray Gilpin, who was very influential in bringing the minister here today. My other colleague, Allison Laporte Oshira, who is made all the arrangements for this event. The egress out of here today is the same as the way you got in. Sometimes leaving this building gets a little complicated, but if you'll just go back the way you came, across the foyer and out the double doors, that's the fastest way to leave. Anyway.